There's a line in old records that no one talks about. Before this line, rulers ruled for 30,000 years at a time. After it, they lived and died like normal people. Before this line, kingship came down from heaven. After it, humans ruled themselves. The Sumerian King List, a clay block sitting in the Ishmaelian Museum at Oxford, marks this line with a single sentence carved in wedge-shaped writing, then the flood swept over. What follows that sentence is history we can recognize, kings. With lifespans we can believe, cities we've dug up, names that show up in other old writings. But what comes before the flood describes something completely different. If you enjoy exploring the mysteries hidden in old documents, hit that like button and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. And as always, the visuals are here for context, but the real evidence is in the writings themselves, sitting in museums, waiting to be read differently. Let's look at what the oldest history records actually say. In 1906, a German-American scholar named Hermann Helpert published his translation of a clay tablet that had been gathering dust in museum storage. It was called the Well-Blundell Prism, dug up from the ruins of Larsa in southern Iraq, and it contained what scholars now call the Sumerian King List. The block itself is small, about 8 inches tall, made of baked clay, covered on all 4 sides with tiny wedge marks pressed into wet clay over 4,000 years ago. It's not mythology. It's not poetry. It reads like an office record, a list. The kind of document a royal writer would keep to track who ruled and whether they were legitimate. It begins with a statement that feels almost casual in how enormous it is. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Then it lists rulers. Each entry follows the same format: name, city, length of rule. Alulum of Eridu 28,800 years. Alalgar of Eridu 36,000 years. Imeluana of Batabira 43,200 years. The writer continues through 8 kings across 5 cities. No comments, no explanations, just names and numbers recorded with the same careful attention used for grain counts and land surveys. The total, carefully added up, 241,200 years. And then, without ceremony or explanation, the list states, then the flood swept over. Here's what makes this document impossible to ignore. After that line about the flood, the king list doesn't end. It continues. New kings, new cities, new dynasties. But now the numbers change. Post-flood rulers ruled for 600 years, then 400, then 126, then 90. The reigns get shorter quickly until they reach what historians call believable lengths, the kind of lifespans actual human beings might have. And then the list does something that changes everything. It names Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, his reign the king list records as 126 years. Gilgamesh, his epic poem, is one of humanity's oldest surviving works of writing. Gilgamesh, his city walls archaeologists have actually dug up. Gilgamesh was real. The Sumerian King List places him in the same document, written by the same writers, using the same office-like tone as the kings who supposedly ruled for 40,000 years. This creates a problem that regular archaeology has never solved well. If the second half of the King List is accepted as real history, and it is, because we can verify its later rulers through other sources, then why do we automatically dismiss the first half as pure fantasy? The same writer wrote both sections. The same format applies to both. The document makes no difference between the mythical and the historical. It presents them as one continuous timeline, interrupted only by a flood. To accept half and reject half isn't good scholarship. It's choosing which evidence to ignore. The impossibly long reigns aren't random. They follow a careful mathematical system based on the Sumerian BASC 60 number framework, the same system that gave us 60 seconds and 60 minute hours. The Sumerians' largest time unit was called a sar, representing 3,600 years. Look at the reigns again. Alulum 28,800 years, that's 8 sar. Alalgar 36,000 years, that's 10 sar. Imeluana 43,200 years, that's 12 sar. Every pre-flood reign is a precise multiple of 3,600. This isn't the work of storytellers making up imprecise-sounding numbers. This is systematic, calculated, the kind of precision you'd expect from a culture that invented the first written accounting systems and developed astronomy charts accurate enough to track Venus's movements. The writers were recording something they understood to be ordered, structured, and real. But what? 2 possibilities emerge, and neither is comfortable. The first, these numbers are symbolic representations of eras, dynasties, or cosmic cycles compressed into the reigns of individual rulers. But if that's true, why not say so? Why frame them as personal kingships with specific names attached? The second possibility is more unsettling. The King List's opening line gives us the framework: after the kingship descended from heaven. For the Sumerians, rulership wasn't a human invention. It wasn't something early communities developed naturally through trial and error. It was something given an institution delivered to earth from outside. Here's what the King List doesn't explain: where did the kingship go after the flood? The document records that it continued, passed from city to city, dynasty to dynasty, but it never again descended from heaven. It never again produced rulers with impossible lifespans. After the flood, kings ruled by family line, by military conquest, by political maneuvering, but never again by direct divine appointment. The gods didn't die in the flood. The temples remained. Rituals continued. Prayers were offered. But the gods stopped ruling. This shift appears in Egyptian records, biblical family trees, and kingship traditions across the ancient world in an early age of direct divine involvement, followed by a sudden transition to human independence. If the Sumerian King List is recording actual history, even symbolically, then it's not describing the birth of civilization. It's describing the moment humanity was left to govern itself. What the King List forces us to confront isn't whether ancient gods were real in some literal sense. It's whether ancient records consistently describe a withdrawal event, a moment when beings who had ruled, instructed, and structured early societies stopped their direct involvement. A boundary after which humanity had to maintain civilization rather than receive it. The flood isn't the story of punishment or cleansing. It's the story of closure. And if the oldest historical document in human possession marks that closure as the beginning of recognizable human history, then we need to ask a question that makes most historians deeply uncomfortable. What exactly was the world like before the gods left? And why do the records insist they were ever here at all? The British Museum holds a fragment that most visitors walk past without a second glance. Its catalogue number K11261 plus a broken clay tablet covered in cuneiform script, part of what scholars call the dynastic chronicle, dating to around 500 BC. It's one of several copies writers made of much older king lists, comparing different versions, noting differences, trying to fix contradictory reign lengths. Even the ancient Babylonians found these early records confusing. What troubled them wasn't the existence of pre-flood kings that much, they accepted as historical fact. What troubled them was the inconsistency in the numbers. Some versions listed 8 antediluvian rulers. Others listed 10. Reign lengths varied wildly between copies. But every single version agreed on one thing: there was a clear break, a before and an after. And the flood marked the boundary between them. Modern scholarship treats this break as mythological, a convenient story device ancient cultures used to separate legendary times from historical ones. But that explanation assumes ancient writers couldn't tell the difference between legend and record-keeping. The evidence suggests otherwise. When you examine the Sumerian King List alongside its later Babylonian copies, a pattern emerges that's difficult to explain as simple mythology. The pre-flood section is stable. Despite being copied and recopied across thousands of years, the names remain consistent. Alulim is always first. Eridu is always the first city. The structure holds. The post-flood section, by contrast, shows the expected variations you'd find in any historical document passed down across centuries. Different dynasties emphasize regional variations, political edits. This is backward from what you'd expect if the pre-flood section were invented. Myths evolve. They shift. Details change with each telling. Historical records, when copied carefully, remain consistent. The pre-flood king list behaves like something being preserved, not created. The Sumerian phrase used to describe what happened after the flood is Namligal kingship, not rulership or government in an abstract sense, but the specific institution of sacred kingship. Namligal appears throughout Mesopotamian texts with a consistent meaning: legitimate authority that comes from divine approval. It's what separated a king from a warlord, a dynasty from a military takeover. The king list states that after the flood, Namligal was brought down again to the city of Kish, not established, not invented, but brought down again. The language suggests restoration of something that had existed before. But the text never claims the pre-flood kings ruled by the same method. They're simply listed. No divine approval mentioned. No legitimacy argued. It's as if their authority was obvious in a way that later rulers' authority was not. After the flood, kings needed justification. They needed to claim divine appointment, build monuments, order inscriptions declaring their legitimacy. The early kings apparently didn't. The shift in reign lengths is dramatic enough to notice immediately, but there's a subtler change that appears across multiple ancient Near Eastern sources. Pre-flood rulers are described with what language experts call passive authority. They don't conquer, they don't build, they don't campaign, they simply are kings. The land is under their rule without explanation of how that rule was achieved or maintained. Post-flood rulers, even legendary ones like Gilgamesh, are defined by their actions. They build walls. They fight enemies. They quest for immortality. They do things to make their power legitimate. This shift appears not just in Sumerian texts, but in Egyptian records, where the god dynasties that ruled before the first dynasty are listed without accomplishments, while human pharaohs immediately start building monuments and recording military victories. It's as if early rulership was a state of being, while later rulership became a performance. Archaeological surveys of the earliest Mesopotamian settlements reveal something unexpected. Cities like Eridu, the first city listed in the King List, show evidence of sophisticated city planning from their earliest layers. No gradual growth from village to town to city. Eridu appears in the archaeological record already organized around a central temple complex, with clear zones for residential, administrative, and sacred spaces. The same pattern appears at Uruk, at Ur, at Battabir. Early settlement layers show advanced design principles already in place. Standard archaeological interpretation explains this as evidence that city building developed elsewhere first and spread to Mesopotamia, but there's no clear elsewhere in the archaeological record, no obvious prototype cities. Mesopotamian city planning appears, functions efficiently for centuries, and then, like the king list itself, seems to shift after a boundary we can't quite date, but that corresponds roughly to the period ancient sources call the flood. After this boundary, cities grow naturally. They expand randomly. They show the expected patterns of human trial and error development. Before it, they appear complete. Modern histories of civilization begin with Sumerian city-states around 3500 BC. They describe the gradual invention of writing, the slow development of bronze metalworking, the emergence of social hierarchy. But the Sumerians themselves didn't describe their civilization this way. They described it as something maintained after a catastrophic interruption, something carried forward by survivors who remembered a previous order. The king list doesn't say Eridu was founded or Alulim established kingship. It says kingship descended to Eridu. It was already there, already functioning, already complete. And then, after 241,200 years and 8 rulers, it stopped functioning in whatever way it had functioned before. The flood swept over, and afterward, humanity had to figure out how to operate a civilization they inherited but didn't design. If the oldest historical record marks a transition instead of a beginning, what exactly changed? More importantly, who was no longer there to maintain it? In the Louvre Museum, tablet AO 8864 preserves something unusual, a Babylonian chronicle from around 1700 BC that lists the rulers of Isin, a city that rose to power after Ur's collapse. The text follows standard king list format: names, reign lengths, significant events, but the opening line is different from later entries. It reads, after the divine Ishbir. Not King Ishbir, not Ishbir beloved of Enlil. It uses Dinger, the cuneiform sign that specifically means divinity, the same symbol used for gods. Yet Ishbir ruled around 2000 BC, well into the historical period. His dynasty lasted barely a century before collapsing. His accomplishments are documented in ordinary administrative texts about grain distribution and border disputes. He was, by all evidence, entirely human. So why does the chronicle call him divine? The answer appears in what comes after. Later Isin kings are never called divine, they're mighty king, beloved of the gods, appointed by Enlil but never themselves gods. Something changed between the first ruler and his successors. Not in reality, but in how rulership itself was understood. The early post-flood period shows rulers desperately claiming divinity they no longer possessed naturally. Sumerian contains 2 different grammar structures for describing divine rulership, and the difference is revealing. When texts describe pre-flood or immediate post-flood rulers, they use Namdinjur or divine nature. It's a state of being, like Namligal, kingship, or Namtil, life. Not a title granted but a quality you naturally have. When later texts describe kings claiming divine status, they used Njurgu, my god, or as a god, with a possessive or comparative ending. It's hopeful, metaphorical, something being claimed, not something that simply is. This language shift appears across Mesopotamian texts around the same time boundary. The third dynasty of Ur, around 2100 BC, represents the last major attempt to revive the concept of divine kingship in Sumerian civilization. Kings like Ur-Nammu and Shulgi built massive temple complexes, ordered hymns describing their divinity, and restructured the entire administrative system around their godlike status. It lasted 3 generations. Afterward, no Mesopotamian dynasty seriously claimed divine rulership again. Kings remained beloved of gods, chosen by gods, granted authority by gods, always mediated, never direct. The age of god-kings ended not with a dramatic overthrow, but with a quiet recognition that such rulership was no longer possible. The Sumerian king lists names 5 antediluvian cities: Eridu, Battabir, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. Archaeological evidence confirms these are among the oldest settlements in Mesopotamia. But here's what's strange: post-flood, when new cities emerge and rise to power, Kish, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, the texts always credit their founding to human kings or divine patrons working through human agents. We're told who built the first temples, who laid out the city walls, who established the institutions. The 5 antediluvian cities have no such founding stories. They simply are already functioning when the king list begins, already complete with their temple complexes and administrative structures. Eridu's temple to Enki, called the Ibtu, appears in texts as if it had always existed. No construction story, no dedication ceremony. The god is simply there in his temple in his city from the beginning. Later temples have elaborate foundation myths. Kings describe laying the first brick, performing sacred rituals, receiving divine approval for the construction. The earliest temples are treated as facts of geography, like mountains or rivers. A careful reading of early Mesopotamian royal inscriptions reveals titles that appear briefly after the flood and then disappear completely from the historical record. The most striking is Ninmia, roughly translatable as Lord of all the divine powers. It appears in fragmentary texts describing the immediate post-flood rulers of Kish. But by the time of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, it's gone. Later kings claim impressive titles: King of the Four Quarters, Shepherd of the Black-Headed People, Mighty Man of Emil. But never again do they claim control over me, the divine powers or cosmic principles themselves. The concept of me is central to Mesopotamian thought. These were the fundamental principles that governed reality: kingship, priesthood, truth, falsehood, craftsmanship, agriculture. There were laws humans invented, but forces they discovered and learned to use. Early post-flood rulers claimed control over the me themselves. Later rulers merely claimed to exercise kingship, which was itself one of the me. The difference is big. One group positioned themselves as administrators of cosmic principles. The next group positioned themselves as subjects operating within those principles. Authority of a completely different type had withdrawn. Here's what makes this pattern difficult to dismiss as simple political evolution: the religious infrastructure never collapsed. Temples continued operating. Priest classes maintained their positions. Rituals were performed with increasing complexity and precision. The gods remained central to Mesopotamian culture for thousands of years after the flood boundary. But the gods stopped governing. Early texts describe gods making direct decisions about where cities should be built, which kings should rule, when wars should be fought. These aren't prayers requesting guidance. They're administrative communications. The Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest Sumerian creation texts, describes Nintur, the goddess who births humanity, walking among cities, making decisions, reorganizing settlements. The language is immediate and physical. After the flood boundary, divine communication becomes mediated. Gods speak through omens, through dreams, through priests reading liver patterns or the flight of birds. The shift is from dialogue to divination. Gods who once gave instructions now require interpretation. What makes this withdrawal pattern so historically problematic is that religious tradition insists nothing changed. Priests in 500 BC performed rituals traced back, they claimed, to antediluvian times. Temple liturgies preserve phrases in archaic Sumerian that later priests didn't fully understand, but carefully maintained anyway. The forms continued. The institutions remained. The sacred calendar still structured the year. But the presence described in the earliest texts, the direct, unmediated, physically present divine authority, had become memory preserved in ritual. Kings still claimed divine appointment, but they required extensive theological justification for that claim: detailed coronation rituals, priestly verification, omen readings, and public ceremonies. None of this appears in descriptions of antediluvian rulership. Early kingship required no justification because there was no one to justify it to. Authority descended from heaven and simply was. Later kingship required constant justification because it now existed in the absence of its original source. If the gods didn't die and they didn't rule anymore, where did they go? And why did every culture that inherited their empty temples spend thousands of years trying to call them back? The Turin royal canon, housed in the Museo Egizio in Turin, is one of the most fragmented and important documents from ancient Egypt, dating to the reign of Ramesses II around 1250 BC. It's a papyrus scroll that originally listed every pharaoh from the divine dynasties through the human rulers of the New Kingdom. Much of it is damaged beyond recovery, but one section survives almost intact: the transition point. The papyrus lists the Shumsahor, the followers of Horus, 9 semi-divine dynasties that ruled Egypt before the First Dynasty. Their combined reign is given as 13,420 years. Then comes a damaged section where the papyrus breaks. When it resumes, we're reading about Menes, the first historically accepted pharaoh, whose reign is listed as 62 years. From 13,420 years of divine rule to 62 years of human kingship. The papyrus doesn't explain this shift. It simply records both as consecutive historical periods. What makes this particularly striking is that Egyptian priests of the Greco-Roman period, writing thousands of years after these events, maintain the exact same timeline framework. Manetho, writing around 280 BC, preserves the same divine dynasties, the same impossible time spans, and the same abrupt transition. They weren't inventing mythology. They were preserving a timeline they believed to be factual. The Book of Genesis presents a lifespan curve that shouldn't exist in religious literature. It's too specific, too systematic, too mathematically precise to serve a theological purpose. Before the flood, Adam lives 930 years. Seth lives 912 years. Methuselah, the longest lived, reaches 969 years. The flood occurs. Immediately after, Shem lives 600 years. His son Arpachshad lives 438 years. The next generation drops to 433 years. By Abraham's time, 10 generations post-flood, lifespans have collapsed to 175 years. By Moses, 120 years is presented as exceptional. By David's era, Psalm 90 describes a normal human lifespan as 70 years, or 80 if our strength endures essentially. Modern human longevity. This isn't poetic or symbolic. The numbers decrease with mathematical regularity, generation by generation, following a curve of biological decline. If Genesis were purely mythological, why include this pattern? Why not keep lifespans consistently extraordinary throughout, or consistently normal? Why show a systematic collapse over exactly 10 generations? The pattern suggests the preservation of a timeline tradition that predates the biblical text itself. What forces us to take these timelines seriously isn't that one culture recorded extreme lifespans. It's that multiple geographically separated cultures record the same pattern. Sumerian King List 8 rulers, 241,200 years total, then the flood, then reigns measured in centuries dropping rapidly to decades. Egyptian records divine dynasties lasting millennia, then the flood, remembered as the first time ending, then human pharaohs with normal lifespans. Biblical genealogy patriarchs living nearly a millennium, then the flood, then a generational decline to modern human longevity. These texts weren't written in consultation with each other. The Sumerian King List predates Genesis by over 1,000 years. Egyptian dynastic records developed independently in a completely different language and cultural context. Yet all three preserve the same story structure: extreme longevity before a catastrophic boundary, followed by rapid biological normalization. Coincidence requires believing three separate cultures independently invented the exact same false pattern and maintained it through thousands of years of textual transmission. The alternative is that all three are preserving fragmented memories of the same timeline reality. Ancient chronologists notice something modern scholars tend to dismiss: the numbers are random. The antediluvian reigns in the Sumerian King List are all multiples of 3,600 the Sar, their highest time unit. This has led scholars to suggest the numbers are purely symbolic cosmic cycles represented as individual reigns. But that theory falls apart when you examine the post-flood section. The post-flood reigns don't follow neat mathematical patterns. They're irregular, inconsistent, historically plausible. Some kings rule 90 years, others 30, others 7. It's exactly the kind of variation you'd expect from real historical data. If the pre-flood numbers are symbolic, why does the symbolism suddenly stop after the flood? Why switch from cosmic mathematics to chaotic historical reality, at exactly the same boundary marked by other cultures? The same problem appears in Genesis. Pre-flood patriarchs show number patterns many of their ages are multiples of significant numbers in Hebrew numerology. Post-flood descendants show no such patterns. Their lifespans are irregular, declining at different rates, historically messy. The shift from mathematical order to mathematical chaos happens at the same boundary in both traditions. The Turin Canon's damaged section: the break between divine and human dynasties corresponds to a period Egyptian tradition called Saptipi, the first time. Later Egyptian texts don't describe Saptipi as a creation event. They describe it as an ending: the time when the gods physically ruled Egypt from Memphis and Heliopolis ended, and the time of humans began. The Palermo stone, one of Egypt's oldest royal annals, dating to the 5th dynasty around 2400 BC, contains a fragmentary section listing pre-dynastic rulers. The entries are partially destroyed, but the surviving names use the divine determinative, the hieroglyphic symbol indicating gods, not humans. These weren't mythological additions made by later writers. They're part of Egypt's earliest attempt at systematic historical record-keeping. Egyptian chronology, like Mesopotamian and biblical chronology, treats the pre-catastrophe period not as mythology, but as a different historical era governed by different rules. If these lifespans were metaphorical or symbolic, why show decline? Metaphors don't need to degrade. Symbols can remain constant. If early cultures wanted to communicate divine authority or legendary status, they could have simply maintained extraordinary lifespans throughout their records. Instead, all three traditions show the same systematic collapse. Sumerian post-flood kings don't immediately become mortal. The transition takes centuries, with each generation reigning slightly less time than the previous one, until they reach historically normal lengths. Biblical patriarchs don't suddenly live 80 years after the flood. They decline gradually, generation by generation, as if some biological capacity were being lost little by little. Egyptian pharaohs don't instantly become fully human after the divine dynasties. Early dynastic kings still claim partial divinity, semi-divine status. Connection to the gods claims that weaken with each successive dynasty, until they become purely ceremonial. This is the pattern of something being lost, not invented, the pattern of an inheritance running out. What kind of world allows beings to live for millennia? And why does that world suddenly disappear? More troubling, why would three separate civilizations preserve a memory of that disappearance with such uncomfortable precision? In 1929, archaeologists excavating the ancient city of Uruk uncovered a small limestone tablet no larger than a modern smartphone, catalog number W940826. It's one of the oldest examples of writing ever discovered, dating to approximately 3400 BC. What shocked researchers wasn't that they'd found early writing. It was that the writing was already sophisticated. The tablet contains a complex administrative record calculations involving grain storage, worker rations, and temple distributions. It uses a fully developed number notation system, standardized signs for different types of goods, and demonstrates clear understanding of multiplicative relationships. This isn't primitive scratching or simple pictographs. It's accounting office mathematics used at scale, and it appears in the archaeological record, with no earlier developmental stages. The standard model of civilization assumes a gradual evolution. Simple marks become pictographs, pictographs become ideograms, ideograms eventually develop into full writing systems over centuries of refinement. That progression doesn't exist in Mesopotamia. Writing appears suddenly, already functional, already serving complex administrative purposes. Within 2 generations, barely 60 years, it evolves from this sophisticated accounting notation into full cuneiform, capable of recording abstract ideas, legal codes, and literature. The speed isn't just unusual. According to linguistic models of script development, it's impossible. The Uric tablet uses BASC 60 mathematics, the sexagesimal system. We still use it today: 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. But consider what BASC 60 implies. It's not a simple counting system an early society would naturally develop. BASC 10 makes sense. Humans have 10 fingers. BASC 20 appears in some cultures because we have 20 total digits including toes. BASC 5 emerges from counting on one hand. BASC 60 requires abstract mathematical thinking. It demands understanding of factorization. 60 is divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. This makes it extraordinarily useful for complex calculations, astronomy, and geometry. It's the kind of number system you design if you already understood advanced mathematics and wanted maximum computational flexibility. The Sumerians didn't gradually discover that 60 was a useful base. They started with it. The earliest mathematical tablets assume BASC 60 is foundational. No simpler systems come before it in the archaeological record. Even more curious, when other aspects of Sumerian civilization declined or changed, BASC 60 mathematics persisted. It spread to Babylon, to Egypt, to Greece, eventually to the entire world. The International System of Units still uses it for measuring time and angles. The Bronze Age civilization in southern Iraq developed a mathematical system so efficient that 5,000 years of later civilizations couldn't improve on it. In 1954, excavations at Eridu reached the lowest occupation layers of the city. Archaeologists expected to find simple structures, huts, perhaps early mud brick buildings showing experimental construction techniques. Instead, they found Temple 7, a precisely planned religious complex with a central sanctuary, offering platforms, altar placements, and clear architectural sophistication. The walls were straight. The corners were true right angles. The foundation showed evidence of deliberate site preparation and leveling. This wasn't the first temple. Underneath it were 15 earlier temples, each built directly on top of the previous one, each showing the same architectural skill. The sequence goes down to Temple 1, the earliest structure, radiocarbon dated to around 5400 BC, and Temple 1 isn't primitive. It's simply smaller than the later versions, but equally well built. The temple complex at Eridu shows no learning curve. The earliest version demonstrates the same construction principles as temples built 2,000 years later. The same pattern appears at other early sites. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to 9500 BC, consists of massive stone pillars arranged in circles, carved with sophisticated animal reliefs. No simpler proto-versions exist. No practice pillars. The site appears fully realized. Standard archaeological interpretation suggests skilled workers from unknown earlier cultures built these structures, implying civilization existed somewhere else first. But there is no somewhere else in the record. These are the oldest complex structures discovered. They represent the beginning of monumental architecture, and they're already masterworks. The Code of Ernamu, dating to approximately 2100 BC, is the oldest surviving law code. It's written in clear, organized Sumerian, establishing legal principles, court procedures, and standardized punishments. What's remarkable isn't that early societies had laws. It's the sophistication of the legal reasoning. The code distinguishes between intentional and accidental harm, a concept requiring abstract understanding of mental state. It establishes proportional punishment based on injury severity. It creates different legal categories for free citizens versus slaves, showing complex social stratification already formalized in law. This level of legal philosophy usually develops over centuries. Roman law, often considered the foundation of Western legal tradition, evolved across 800 years of republican and imperial refinement. The Code of Ernamu appears to be based on even earlier legal traditions. It references former judgments and ancient decisions, suggesting Sumerian law was already old by 2100 BC. Yet we have no archaeological evidence of the centuries of legal evolution this suggests. The same problem appears in mathematics. The earliest Sumerian mathematical tablets solve quadratic equations. They calculate square roots and cube roots. They used the Pythagorean theorem 1,000 years before Pythagoras. These are basic mathematics slowly developed by trial and error. They're advanced techniques that normally require generations of mathematical innovation to discover. Babylonian astronomical texts from around 700 BC contain mathematical models predicting planetary movements with startling accuracy. The mathematics involve numerical integration. Iterative approximation wouldn't be rediscovered in Europe until the 17th century. But here's what's strange: these Babylonian tablets explicitly describe their astronomical knowledge as inherited from old texts and ancient observations. The tablets reference astronomical data spanning centuries, eclipse cycles, planetary positions, stellar movements far longer than the lifetime of any individual astronomer or even any individual dynasty. This suggests systematic astronomical observation maintained across generations. But maintained where? The earliest Babylonian astronomical texts appear around 1800 BC, already referencing long-term observation programs. Where are the preceding centuries of recorded observations they claim to be analyzing? The Babylonian priests insisted they were interpreting records from before the flood. Modern scholars dismiss this as mythological framing. But if the astronomical knowledge isn't from pre-flood records, where did it come from? The mathematical sophistication alone represents centuries of development, yet it appears in texts claiming to be copying from older sources we've never found. Here's what makes this pattern truly strange: after the initial burst of sophistication, development slows. Writing appears fully functional around 3400 BC. By 3000 BC, it's recording complex literature. Then it stabilizes. Cuneiform doesn't fundamentally change for the next 2000 years. Improvements are small new signs added, phonetic elements refined, but the basic system remains static. Mathematics appears complete with BASC 60 geometric understanding and algebraic techniques. Then it plateaus. Later cultures use Sumerian mathematics, but don't substantially advance it for millennia. Monumental architecture appears sophisticated at Göbekli Tepe and Eridu. Later temples are larger, more decorated, but not more structurally advanced. The engineering principles stay the same. If civilization were invented from scratch around 3500 BC, we'd expect speeding innovation each generation, building rapidly on previous discoveries. Instead, we see early completion followed by slow refinement. The pattern doesn't match invention. It matches inheritance and gradual loss of understanding. If humans didn't slowly invent civilization, if writing, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, and law appeared already sophisticated, who left behind the instruction manual? And why does the trail of evidence go cold exactly where ancient records say it should, at the flood boundary, where something ended, and humanity had to maintain what remained? The Yale Babylonian collection holds tablet YBC 4644, a clay cylinder from approximately 1800 BC, containing what's known as a liver omen text. It's a divination manual instructing priests how to read the shape, color, and markings on a sacrificed sheep's liver to determine the will of the gods. The tablet is remarkably detailed. It describes 63 different liver configurations and what each supposedly means. A split in the gallbladder indicates military defeat. A darkened left lobe suggests the king's illness. Specific vein patterns predict harvest failures. What makes this text historically significant isn't its content, it's what it represents. By 1800 BC, Mesopotamian priests needed elaborate interpretive systems to understand divine will. The gods no longer gave instructions directly. They communicated through signs that required specialist knowledge to decode. But the texts these same priests preserved describe an earlier time when such interpretation wasn't necessary. The gods simply spoke, gave orders, made decisions openly. Something fundamental had changed in how divine authority functioned, and the change happened exactly where you'd expect if the ancient timelines are accurate, at the boundary. The earliest Sumerian religious texts use a specific grammar structure that later texts avoid: the imperative voice attributed directly to gods without mediation. In the Eridu Genesis, when the god Enki decides to save humanity from the flood, the text reads, "Enki opened his mouth and addressed Isudra, tear down your house, build a boat." Direct speech, clear instruction, no interpretation required. Compare this to texts from 1,000 years later. The Epic of Ere, composed around 800 BC, describes the god Ere's anger at Babylon. But Ere doesn't speak directly to humans. He communicates through dreams given to priests, who then interpret the dream's symbolic content to determine what the god wants. The shift is consistent across the textual record. Early religious texts present gods as participants in conversations. Later texts present gods as sources of signs requiring interpretation. By the first millennium BC, Mesopotamian religion had developed entire professional classes: Beru priests who specialized in ecdyspesy, reading entrails, Asipu priests who interpreted omens, Mahu priests who studied ecstatic visions, all dedicated to decoding divine messages that had apparently stopped being clear. If the gods were always silent, why develop increasingly complex interpretive systems? Why not start with divination? The evolution suggests something was being replaced, a clear signal that had degraded into noise requiring sophisticated filtering to understand. Early temples in Mesopotamia are structurally different from later ones in a way that rarely gets emphasized. Temples at Eridu dating to the 6th millennium BC contain central chambers with raised platforms, presumed god seats, but relatively little space for human worshippers. The architecture suggests the temple was the god's residence, not primarily a gathering place for human religious ceremony. By the 3rd millennium BC, temple design changes. Spaces for priestly activities expand. Storage rooms for ritual tools multiply. Areas for public ceremonies become prominent. The temple evolves from divine residence to interpretive center. The ziggurat, the iconic stepped pyramid temple of later Mesopotamia, appears around 2100 BC, with Urnammu's reconstruction of temple complexes. These massive structures have something earlier temples lack: elaborate processional pathways, spaces for ritual performance, platforms for public displays of religious ceremony. The ziggurat isn't designed for a god who walks into the temple and gives instructions. It's designed for priests who perform increasingly elaborate rituals, attempting to invoke divine presence that no longer shows up automatically. The architecture reflects the theological shift: direct presence replaced by ceremonial invocation. In early Sumerian city-states, the high priest or priestess wasn't an interpreter of divine will. Texts describe the as someone who dwells with the god, suggesting a role as companion or attendant rather than go-between. By the Akkadian period, around 2300 BC, the priesthood is broken into specialized roles. We see distinct classes: those who perform sacrifices, those who maintain temples, those who interpret omens, those who record divine communications received in dreams. This multiplication of religious specialists makes sense only if divine communication has become problematic. If God spoke clearly, you'd need speakers and listeners, not an entire office system of interpretation. The Code of Hammurabi, dated to 1750 BC, provides explicit payment schedules for different types of divination consultations. Extispicy, reading animal organs, commands the highest fees, suggesting it was considered the most reliable method of determining divine will. But reliability implies uncertainty. If the god spoke directly, there would be no fees for interpretation, because there would be nothing to interpret. By the Neo-Assyrian period, around 700 BC, the Mesopotamian royal court employed full-time diviners who filed written reports on every omen, observed bird flights, oil patterns on water, lunar eclipses, unusual births. Archives at Nineveh contain thousands of such reports. The sheer volume of interpretive effort suggests a civilization desperately trying to maintain contact with divine authority that had become unreachable through normal channels. Ritual complexity increases over time in a pattern that mirrors the shift from presence to interpretation. Early Sumerian religious texts describe simple offerings: a god requires grain or beaver specific animals. The offering is made. The text records that the god accepted it or rejected it, implying some clear sign of divine response. By the Babylonian period, rituals have become extraordinarily complex. The Bit Rumki, the ritual washing ceremony, involves precise timing, specific phrases in archaic Sumerian that contemporary priests didn't fully understand, exact positioning of ritual tools, and careful observation for signs of acceptance. The rituals aren't becoming more complex because gods demand it. They're becoming more complex because humans are uncertain whether they're being heard. Later Mesopotamian religious texts include phrases like "if the god accepts this offering, and should the goddess be pleased." Early texts don't contain these conditional statements. They record what the god said or did, not what humans hoped the god might do. The addition of uncertainty into religious language tracks with the shift from dialogue to divination. What makes this transformation historically strange is that later religions don't acknowledge it as a transformation. Babylonian priests in 500 BC performed rituals they claimed were identical to those performed 3,000 years earlier. They maintained temple liturgies in archaic Sumerian, a language no longer spoken. They preserved architectural forms and ceremonial practices that had, according to their own records, been established when the gods dwelt among us. The phrase itself is revealing when the gods dwelt among us past tense. But those same priests never explicitly state that the gods had left. They maintain the idea that proper ritual can still invoke divine presence, that correct interpretation can still figure out divine will. The entire structure of later Mesopotamian religion is built around maintaining contact with something that is no longer present, while never admitting the absence directly. This produces the central paradox of all post-flood religion: elaborate systems designed to communicate with beings who have stopped communicating, performed by specialists who preserve memories of a time when no specialists were needed. Why do all later religions try to interpret silence instead of hearing voices? And if the gods didn't die, if temples remained sacred, if rituals continued, if their names were still invoked, what exactly happened that turned conversation into divination and presence into absence? In the Mesopotamian galleries of the British Museum, tablet K3375 preserves part of the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The section describes Utnapishtim's account of the Great Flood, but there's a detail most visitors overlook. After the waters recede and Utnapishtim makes his sacrifice, the gods gather around the offering like flies, starving and desperate. The god Enlil is furious when he discovers humanity survived. Another god, E, has to argue for humanity's preservation. This isn't the behavior of all-powerful beings running events according to divine plan. These are gods who have lost control of their own catastrophe. The text continues with something even stranger. After the argument, Enlil approaches Utnapishtim and his wife, touches their foreheads, and declares, "Formerly Utnapishtim was a human being, but now he and his wife shall be like us gods." Then he sends them away far away to the mouth of the rivers, a distant place where humans cannot reach. The flood story doesn't end with the gods resuming rulership over a cleansed world. It ends with the last human granted divine status being exiled to a location deliberately removed from human contact. The gods don't return to govern. They retreat, and humanity is left to rebuild without them. Compare flood stories across cultures, and a consistent pattern emerges that contradicts standard mythological interpretation. In the Sumerian version, Ziusudra is warned by Enki and builds a boat. After the flood, he's granted immortality and immediately removed from the world. In the biblical account, Noah is warned by God, builds an ark, survives. After the flood, God makes a covenant, but never again speaks directly to humanity with the same clarity. Later biblical figures must interpret signs, build altars, hope for divine contact. In the Greek tradition, Deucalion is warned by Prometheus, survives the deluge. The gods he knew, the Titans who ruled before, are gone, replaced by the Olympians who rule from a distance. In Hindu tradition, Manu is warned by Matsya, survives the flood. The Satyuga, the golden age of direct divine rulership, ends. The following ages show progressive weakening of divine presence. The pattern isn't punishment followed by restoration. It's warning followed by departure. Survivors are preserved not to serve the gods who saved them, but to continue without them. Between 12,900 and 11,700 years ago, Earth experienced the Younger Dryas, a dramatic climate reversal that interrupted the warming trend following the last ice age. Ice cores from Greenland show temperature drops of up to 15 degrees Celsius, occurring within a decade. Sea levels moved wildly. Massive glacial lake outbursts released catastrophic floods. Megafauna extinction sped up globally. For over 1,000 years, Earth's climate system became unstable in ways that would have made agriculture impossible, coastal settlements unlivable, and larger-scale civilization unsustainable. Then, around 11,700 years ago, the climate suddenly stabilized again. Within a single human lifetime, temperatures normalized. Rainfall patterns became predictable. Sea levels steadied. Conventional archaeology places the origins of civilization after this boundary. Göbekli Tepe, the earliest known monumental architecture, dates to 9500 BC, well after the Younger Dryas ended. The question archaeology struggles with: why did civilization appear so suddenly after the climate stabilized? If humans had the brain capacity and social organization to build Göbekli Tepe in 9500 BC, why didn't they build anything comparable during the preceding 100,000 years of anatomically modern human existence? One explanation: they did. But anything built before the Younger Dryas would have been destroyed by the very climate catastrophe ancient texts remember as the flood. What's consistently strange about flood stories is that survivors possess knowledge inappropriate for their circumstances. Utnapishtim knows how to build a seaworthy vessel using precise mathematical ratios. He's given detailed construction specifications, yet he's described as living in a time before the flood, before recognizable civilization begins. Noah receives architectural instructions for the ark that demonstrate understanding of displacement, buoyancy, and structural engineering. Manu is warned by a fish that grows to enormous size, speaks with knowledge of future events, and provides survival instructions. These aren't stories of primitive humans accidentally surviving natural disasters. They're stories of individuals specifically chosen and instructed, given knowledge they shouldn't possess, warned by beings who understand what's coming. The preservation isn't random. It's selective. And those selected carry something: forward knowledge, instructions, or simply memory of what existed before. After the biblical flood, God establishes a covenant with Noah: never again will flood waters destroy all life. The promise is often interpreted as reassurance. But read carefully, it's a statement of withdrawal. God isn't promising continued presence or protection. He's promising non-interference. The rainbow isn't a symbol of divine guardianship. It's a reminder that the direct catastrophic involvement demonstrated in the flood will not happen again. The covenant marks a boundary between an age of direct divine action and an age of human independence. Similar declarations appear in other traditions. After the Greek flood, Zeus promises no more cataclysmic interventions. After the Hindu deluge, the gods retreat into more distant heavens, allowing the ages of man to unfold with decreasing divine involvement. The flood stories aren't about God saving humanity. They're about God stepping back and allowing humanity to continue alone. Modern interpretations of flood myths focus on moral cleansing. Humanity was wicked, gods destroyed the world, survivors represented a fresh start for a purified species. But the ancient texts themselves don't emphasize human wickedness. The Sumerian account gives no moral reason for the flood. The gods simply decide to send it. Enki's decision to save Sudra is shown as rebellion against the other god's decree, not as reward for goodness. The Babylonian version in the Epic of Gilgamesh attributes the flood to Enlil's irritation at human noise, disturbing his sleep, hardly a moral judgment. Even Genesis, which does mention human wickedness, describes a world where the sons of God were interbreeding with humans, producing Nephilim. The wickedness isn't clearly defined, and the flood's primary effect isn't purification, it's separation. After the flood, the sons of God are gone. The Nephilim are gone. The beings who walked among humans and produced hybrid offspring are absent from post-flood stories. The flood doesn't cleanse humanity. It removes what was among humanity. At archaeological sites across the Near East, there's a layer. Excavations that are uncovered an 8-foot deposit of water-laid clay with no artifacts, separating earlier occupation layers from later ones. Leonard Woolley, the excavator, initially declared he'd found evidence of Noah's flood. Similar sterile flood deposits appear at Kish, at Shurapak, at Uruk. Not all sites show the layer. Not all layers date to the same period. But the deposits exist evidence of significant flooding events in Mesopotamia's early history. The layers aren't global. They don't prove a worldwide deluge. But they demonstrate that catastrophic flooding was a lived reality for early Mesopotamian populations. What makes these deposits archaeologically significant isn't whether they prove the flood myth. It's what appears after them, the sudden explosion of sophisticated urban culture in Sumer around 3500 BC. Before the flood layers, scattered settlements, symbol structures. After the flood layers, cities, writing, complex administration, all appearing within a few centuries. As if civilization wasn't invented after the floods but rebuilt. If the flood closed the age of gods, who carried memory of that world into the new one? And what did they remember that made every later culture structure its entire timeline around the same catastrophic boundary? In 1853, Hormuz Rassam, working under Austin Henry Layard, discovered 12 clay tablets in the ruins of Ashurbanibal's library at Nineveh. When translated, they contained the most complete version of the Epic of Gilgamesh ever found as story, that scholars immediately recognized as one of humanity's oldest surviving tales. But buried in the 11th tablet was something that transformed how we understand the epic's purpose. Gilgamesh doesn't quest for immortality because he fears death as a concept. He quests for it because he knows it once existed. He's searching for something his ancestors possessed, and he believes he's entitled to reclaim it. The epic isn't about a king's fear of dying. It's about humanity's first confrontation with the fact that the world before the flood, is permanently closed. And the being who delivers this message is the last person who remembers that world firsthand. The Sumerian King List records Gilgamesh as the 5th king of Uruk's first dynasty, reigning for 126 years around 2700 BC. Archaeological evidence confirms a historical king named Gilgamesh. Early texts reference him. Later kings claim descent from him. His construction projects can be verified. But what makes Gilgamesh unique in the king list is his parentage. The text identifies his father as Lugalbanda, a mortal king who ruled before him. But his mother is listed as Ninsun, described explicitly as a goddess. The text uses the divine sign, leaving no confusion. Gilgamesh is called a Shumbal, a Sumerian term meaning great dragon or prime serpent, but used in royal context to indicate semi-divine status. He's Swathird's god, on a third human, a biological impossibility that the epic treats as historical fact. This makes him a bridge figure, the last king with direct divine bloodline, born late enough to be historically verifiable, but early enough to remember, or have been told about, a time when such bloodline was normal. His reign falls exactly in the transitional period after the flood, after the impossible lifespans ended, but still close enough to that boundary, that memory of the prior age would have been vivid. The epic begins not with Gilgamesh fearing death, but with him experiencing it. His companion Enkidu dies, and Gilgamesh is devastated not just emotionally but existentially. He says something revealing: "Shall I die too? Am I not like Enkidu?" The question isn't worried fear. It's genuine confusion. Gilgamesh has divine blood. His mother is a goddess. His ancestors in the king list rulers just a few generations before him lived for centuries. The pre-flood kings lived for millennia. Death for beings like him shouldn't be inevitable. Yet Enkidu dies completely, permanently, reduced to dust like any mortal human. And Gilgamesh realizes that whatever biological advantage his divine heritage once provided, it's failing. The immortality that should be his birthright is slipping away. His quest isn't about avoiding death. It's about reclaiming what his bloodline should have guaranteed. Gilgamesh's journey to find Utnapishtim isn't geographically random. Every location he passes through is described as progressively more removed from the normal world. He crosses mountain ranges guarded by scorpion beings, creatures, explicitly described as half-human, half-divine, relics of an earlier creation. They're shocked that a mortal would attempt the passage, but they recognize his partial divinity and let him through. He travels through 12 leagues of darkness, a journey no human has made before. The path exists, but it's not meant for post-flood humanity. He crosses the waters of death, which his boatman warns will kill him if he touches them. The precautions required cutting 120 punting poles because each can only be used once suggests this isn't a metaphorical journey, but a description of navigating some genuinely dangerous boundary. The geography of the quest maps onto a psychological reality. Gilgamesh is traveling backward in time, crossing boundaries that separate the post-flood world from remnants of what existed before. And at the end of this journey, he finds the only human being who survived the transition intact. When Gilgamesh finally reaches Utnapishtim, the survivor's first words are unexpected. He doesn't congratulate Gilgamesh on completing an impossible journey. He asks, "Why are your cheeks thin, your face sunken? Why is your heart so sad, your features so worn? Why is there so much sadness deep within you?" Utnapishtim sees Gilgamesh's divine heritage and sees it failing. Gilgamesh is aging, deteriorating, becoming fully mortal despite his goddess mother. Gilgamesh explains he's searching for eternal life, the life Utnapishtim possesses. And Utnapishtim's response is devastating. He doesn't say immortality is impossible. He says it's no longer available. He tells the flood story, but not as Gilgamesh expects. Utnapishtim didn't earn immortality through goodness or wisdom. He was granted it by Ea as compensation after surviving a catastrophe the gods themselves regretted. Then Enlil, in a moment of guilt, granted Utnapishtim and his wife immortality and immediately exiled them to the distant edge of the world, beyond human reach. The message is clear: immortality was a closed dispensation, a one-time exception. The mechanism that produced it no longer functions. Utnapishtim offers Gilgamesh a test: stay awake for 7 days and 7 nights. If he can't even conquer sleep, how can he conquer death? Gilgamesh immediately falls asleep. When he wakes and protests that he only slept a moment, Utnapishtim's wife points to 7 loaves of bread she baked one each day Gilgamesh slept, now in various stages of decay. The test seems random until you understand what it represents. Sleep, in ancient Near Eastern thought, was the little death, that daily surrender of consciousness. The antediluvian kings, if they truly lived for tens of thousands of years, would have had fundamentally different relationships with sleep, rest, and biological decay. Gilgamesh can't stay awake for a week because his biology is human. His divine heritage gives him strength, size, exceptional abilities, but it doesn't give him the fundamental physiological difference that separated the pre-flood rulers from post-flood humanity. Utnapishtim isn't testing Gilgamesh's worthiness. He's demonstrating biological incompatibility. The door isn't closed because Gilgamesh failed. The door is closed because the world beyond it no longer operates on principles that support beings like him. In an act of pity, Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh about a plant that grows at the bottom of the cosmic ocean, a plant that restores youth, though not immortality. Gilgamesh dives down, finds it, and begins his journey home. He doesn't plan to use it himself immediately. He plans to bring it back to Uruk, test it on an elderly man, and only if it works will he use it to restore his own youth repeatedly. This is the mindset of someone who understands he's recovering lost technology. He's going to test it scientifically, verify it works, then use it. But while Gilgamesh bathes in a pool, a serpent smells the plant's fragrance, emerges from the water, and eats it. The snake immediately sheds its skin and disappears, rejuvenated. Gilgamesh sits down and weeps. The text is explicit about why, not because he fears death, but because the last possibility of reclaiming what his ancestors had is gone. The plant existed. It worked. The serpent proved it. But Gilgamesh will never possess it. When Gilgamesh returns to Uruk, the epic describes him showing his companion Shinabi the city walls, the massive fortifications he built that still stood in historical times. The text shifts focus from what Gilgamesh couldn't achieve to what he did. He didn't restore the age of divine kings. He didn't reclaim immortality. He didn't reopen the antediluvian world. But he built. He governed. He left structures that outlasted his lifespan. The epic's conclusion is quietly radical: human limitation can still produce permanence. Mortal hands can create works that go beyond individual death. Gilgamesh's walls became legendary precisely because they were built by someone who accepted mortality and built anyway. The epic ends not with triumph, but with practical adaptation. The old world is closed. The gods have withdrawn. Immortality is gone. What remains is the work itself. What makes the Epic of Gilgamesh more than mythology is that Gilgamesh was real. His city was real. His construction projects were real. Later kings referenced him as a historical example. His walls were maintained for over 1,000 years. His name appears in king lists alongside verifiable historical rulers. This means the epic's central claim that a semi-divine king in the early post-flood period sought to reclaim immortality, and was explicitly told it was no longer possible, was preserved as historical memory, not invented fantasy. The people who maintained this story for 3,000 years believed it described a real king confronting a real boundary, a boundary between an age when divine heritage meant something and an age when it didn't. If even the gods' descendants were denied the old world, what did humanity inherit instead? And if the answer is nothing but the responsibility to continue, why do all later civilizations structure themselves as if they're maintaining something rather than creating something new? The stele of Hammurabi, carved around 1750 BC and now housed in the Louvre, shows the king standing before the seated god Shamash, receiving the symbols of justice. It's one of the most famous images from the ancient world, a king claiming divine authorization for his legal code. But look closely at what the image actually shows. Hammurabi isn't a god. He's unmistakably human, standing below Shamash in a posture of receiving. The god doesn't speak directly. He holds out the rod and ring, symbols of authority which Hammurabi must take and interpret. This is kingship through mediation, authorized but not divine, legitimate but fundamentally human. The 282 laws inscribed below show something even more telling. They're enforced by human courts, run by human officials, and designed to resolve human disputes without requiring divine intervention. The code never says Shamash declares or the god's command. It says if a man does this, then this shall be done to him. Human authority operating within inherited frameworks but without supernatural enforcement. This is what the world looks like after the gods stop ruling. Post-flood kingship required justification in ways earlier rulership apparently didn't. Kings ordered inscriptions explaining why they deserved to rule. They built monuments proclaiming their legitimacy. They traced family trees back to divine ancestors, but never claimed to be divine themselves. Anemu's law code, predating Hammurabi by 3 centuries, begins with an elaborate introduction, after Enlil had turned over the kingship of Erd-Anana, at that time Didunammu, son born of Ninsun, for his beloved mother who bore him. The language is defensive. He's arguing for legitimacy, citing divine approval, emphasizing his bloodline. The antediluvian kings needed no such arguments. They simply were. This shift from natural authority to argued authority defines the post-flood political landscape across all ancient civilizations. What's historically curious is how much administrative structure survived the transition. Temple economies continued operating on systems established before the flood boundary. The distribution of grain rations, the organization of labor, the mathematical frameworks for taxation all show continuity. Sumerian cities maintained administrative archives using accounting methods that appear fully formed in the earliest examples. Later dynasties didn't invent new systems. They maintained existing ones. Egyptian pharaohs ruled through nome structures, administrative divisions that Egyptian tradition explicitly traced to pre-dynastic times. The system was inherited, not designed. Chinese historical records describe the Xia dynasty receiving administrative principles from the legendary Yellow Emperor and sage kings. Later dynasties modified these principles but treated them as ancient wisdom to be preserved. The pattern suggests early post-flood civilizations weren't inventing government. They were maintaining it. After the initial burst of civilization around 3500 BC, development slows to recognizably human pace. Bronze metalworking improves gradually. Writing systems evolve step by step. Architecture becomes more sophisticated through trial and error spanning centuries. This is normal technological progression, each generation building on the previous one's discoveries. But it contrasts sharply with the appearance of BASC 60 mathematics, sophisticated urban planning, and complex astronomical knowledge that show no developmental earlier versions. If the same cultures could slowly develop bronze alloys over 1,000 years, why does their mathematical system appear complete? The pattern matches inheritance followed by gradual loss of understanding, then slow redevelopment through human effort. Despite ruling independently, post-flood kings never stopped referencing the earlier age. Mesopotamian rulers called themselves shepherds, using terminology that appears in antediluvian contexts. Egyptian pharaohs claimed to restore the principles of Ma'at from the first time. Chinese emperors invoked the mandate of heaven as if copying an earlier system. The language of rulership remained anchored to a prior model that no longer functioned but was never forgotten. Even as kingship became increasingly human based on military power, administrative skill, family succession, the ideal remained divine rulership that had apparently existed before. Human history, as we recognize it, begins when humanity has to maintain civilization without those who established it. Kings rule but justify their rule. Laws function but require human enforcement. Progress continues but step by step. The systems work but like inherited machinery no one fully understands anymore. Were humans finally free, or simply left unsupervised? And if supervision ended at the flood, why does every later civilization organize itself, as if waiting for that supervision to return? In 1872, George Smith, a self-taught Assyriologist working in the British Museum, was cataloguing fragments from Ashurbanipal's library when he came across tablet K3375. As he translated the cuneiform, he realized he was reading an account of a great flood, with details strikingly similar to the biblical story but written over 1,000 years earlier. His discovery shocked Victorian England. It meant the flood wasn't uniquely biblical. It was remembered across cultures, preserved in multiple independent traditions, recorded by writers who had no contact with Hebrew scripture. But Smith's discovery raised a question no one has satisfactorily answered: why would completely separate civilizations preserve the same memory with such consistent detail? Either the flood was real and globally significant enough to be remembered everywhere, or every major culture independently invented the same false story about a catastrophe that divided history into before and after. The first option requires accepting that ancient timelines preserve real boundaries. The second requires believing in statistically impossible coincidence. Neither explanation is comfortable. The evidence we've examined allows three possible interpretations, none of which can be definitively proven or dismissed. The first, these records are mythological symbolic representations of social transitions, cosmic cycles, or the shift from oral tradition to written history. The gods are metaphors for early social order. Their departure represents humanity's psychological maturation from dependence to independence. This interpretation explains the symbolism but struggles with the specificity. Myths simplify. These records complicate. They preserve mathematical precision, family tree detail, and timeline consistency across cultures that had no contact. The second interpretation, the texts preserve memories of a lost human civilization, a technologically advanced society that existed before the Younger Dryas catastrophe, was largely destroyed, and survived only in fragmentary records maintained by descendant cultures. This explains the sudden appearance of sophisticated knowledge, but requires accepting that an entire advanced civilization vanished so completely that we found almost no physical evidence. It means rewriting the entire archaeological timeline of human development. The third interpretation is the one ancient texts themselves insist on non-human or semi-divine beings ruled early Earth, established civilization's foundational systems, and withdrew after a catastrophic boundary event, leaving humanity to maintain what they'd built. This interpretation takes the sources at face value, but requires accepting premises that violate modern assumptions about what's historically possible. All three explanations are uncomfortable. All three require abandoning some aspect of conventional understanding. What's undeniable, regardless of interpretation, is that ancient records describe something missing, a presence that once was and no longer is, an authority that functioned differently than human rulership, a biological possibility, extraordinary longevity that ended, a directness of divine communication that became mediation, knowledge that appeared complete then required maintenance. The absence is consistent. The boundary is marked. The transition is remembered. Every major civilization structures its timeline around this absence. Every king list marks the boundary. Every flood story describes the withdrawal. Every legal code justifies human authority in terms of what was delegated, not originated. If the absence weren't real, if these were simply myths, why do they all describe loss rather than gain? The standard story of human history is progress from primitive to advanced, from ignorance to knowledge, from barbarism to civilization. But the ancient records tell a different story. They describe civilization as something inherited and maintained, knowledge as something preserved rather than discovered, authority as something delegated then adapted to human limitations. If the records are even partially accurate, human history isn't the story of climbing upward from nothing. It's the story of learning to operate systems we didn't design, maintaining structures we didn't build, and adapting knowledge we don't fully understand. We didn't become civilized. We became the caretakers of civilization. There's no dramatic conclusion to this investigation because the evidence doesn't allow one. The Sumerian King List still sits in the Ishmaelian Museum. The lifespan collapses still appear in multiple independent timelines. The flood boundary still marks the transition point in every major ancient tradition. The temples remain, but they're archaeological sites now. The rituals that once invoked divine presence are academic subjects. The gods who descended from heaven are mythology. But the absence that left the gap between what the earliest records describe and what later history shows remains unexplained. Human history may not be the story of becoming civilized. It may be the story of learning to live without those who once were. And if that's true, everything we call progress might simply be adaptation, this slow, painful process of learning to maintain alone what was once maintained for us. What if everything we call history is simply what happened after the gods left?